Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. You probably know that rhyme. It's one of the most chilling bits of American folklore, really. Turns a horrific 19th century crime into, well, a playground chant. But today we're skipping past the rhyme. We want to give you the shortcut, get straight into the real story. Our mission here in this deep dive is to dig into the sources, the history, the court records, the psychological takes to figure out why this crime, this double murder from 1892, still fascinates us. Why does it keep popping up in criminology, in books, in true crime stuff? We're looking at the whole complex picture, psychology, the law, the gender dynamics surrounding Lizzie Borden.
And that's a really important point to make right up front. We're not trying to solve it, not definitively say guilty or innocent. What we're analyzing is why it became such a cultural touchstone. And to do that, you have to see how the sheer brutality of the murders got almost immediately tangled up with what society believed about Lizzie, the suspect.
Exactly. We're stepping into a world obsessed with Victorian propriety, and then boom, this incredibly violent act just shatters everything. So let's go back. Picture it. Fall River, Massachusetts. It's August 4th, 1892. Let's really unpack the pressure cooker that was the Borden house.
Yeah, to get the Borden house, you first need to get Fall River. It was a booming industrial town back then, late 19th century, mostly textile mills.
Yeah.
And a place really hung up on social hierarchy. Money was flowing, but maybe not always from the most established families.
Right. And Andrew Borden, Lizzie's father, he sounds like a prime example of that new money type. Sources say he was smart, very, very careful with money, maybe even miserly, but definitely successful. Made a lot of money in real estate, other businesses. Yeah. But he wasn't really part of the old guard elite.
That's absolutely key to understanding the tension in that house. Andrew Borden had the money, sure, but not the social grace, maybe, and he spent it very, very carefully. They lived in this, well, pretty modest house, kind of cramped, actually, especially compared to the big mansions some of their richer neighbors had up on the hill in Fall River.
So you've got this wealthy family basically living like they're just comfortably middle class.
Yeah.
And that seems to have bred some serious resentment, particularly with Lizzie. She's 32, she's not married, and she's still stuck at home under her father's thumb, financially and emotionally.
Exactly. And this is where the sources bring in this idea of class anxiety. Lizzie was, like we said, sort of upper middle class adjacent. Her frustration wasn't just about inheritance, though. Yeah, that was definitely part of it. It was also knowing she had the wealth, but was still kind of shut out from the really elite social scene in Fall River because, well, her father was seen as maybe a bit rougher on the edges, a bit of a tightwad.
So she's trapped. She has the resources, technically, but can't really use them the way she wants. Yep. Can't host the right parties, can't just move out and live her own life. And she definitely can't escape that tense family atmosphere.
And that atmosphere was really shaped by the people in it. You had Andrew, the controlling father, Abby Borden, the stepmother, and Lizzie's older sister, Emma, who also wasn't married. The dynamic between Lizzie and Abby, her stepmother, seems particularly strained.
That stepmother angle feels crucial, doesn't it? The sources talk about serious resentment, worries that Andrew might give property or money to Abby's family, cutting into what Lizzie and Emma expected to inherit. Apparently, there were actual arguments about property just before the murders, like real bitter fights.
Oh, yeah. There were definite financial disputes. But beyond that, there was just the overall feeling in the house. Sources call it emotionally sterile and authoritarian. And this gets us to that broader psychological context, the gendered suffocation of the Victorian domestic sphere.
What did that suffocation actually mean for someone like Lizzie day to day? Was she literally locked up, or was it more social control?
Oh, it was much more subtle, more pervasive than just being locked in. For women of Lizzie's class in Victorian times, there was this ideal, the angel in the house. She was supposed to be quiet, religious, totally selfless. If you were an unmarried woman over 30, like Lizzie, your whole world was supposed to be the home, obeying your father.
And if you weren't naturally like that, if you had a strong will or were smart or showed emotion, things Lizzie seems to have had, those were seen as, like, dangerous traits, things to be stamped out.
Precisely. So if you're looking for why, for a motive, the sources keep pointing back to this crushing repression, not just money, but that emotional pressure cooker. The psychological take is that all this pressure, the class anxiety, the difficult family dynamics, the social restrictions have built up into something explosive, just waiting for a spark.
Okay, so the scene is set. Rigid society, money without status, a family home simmering with unspoken and sometimes spoken tension, and then August 4th, 1892. That control just snaps.
The crime itself was just unbelievably shocking. Not just who died, but how. It was this act of intense personal violence that, as the sources say, completely shattered Victorian decorum.
So let's walk through that morning, August 4th. Andrew Borden goes out for a bit, business stuff. He comes back, lies down on the sofa downstairs for a nap. In the house at that point are Lizzie and the maid, Bridget Sullivan. She's a really important witness later on. And Abby Borden, the stepmother, is upstairs, making beds, apparently.
And the sequences? Well, it's chilling. Abby was killed first. Found upstairs in the guest room. She'd been hit something like 19 times in the back of the head. Sources describe her skull as basically crushed beyond recognition. I mean, it was an incredibly ferocious attack. Overkill, really.
19 blows. That sheer level of violence against Abby, it really speaks volumes. It suggests intense, focused, personal rage. And the fact that the attacks happened separately, maybe an hour or more apart, that implies some level of planning, or at least the ability to stay composed between the killings.
Right. Andrew Borden was found later, downstairs on that sofa. He'd been struck 10 or 11 times. The sources suggest he was probably asleep or resting when it happened. Again, the wounds point to a sharp weapon, probably a hatchet or something similar, a small, heavy kind with a fairly long handle.
And the weapon choice itself, the hatchet. That's fascinating, isn't it? It means the killer had to be right there, up close, using repeated forceful blows. It wasn't distant, it was intimate, brutal. Either a struggle or, in Andrew's case, almost like an execution. And a hatchet was just a common tool, something you'd find around the house, which makes the horror feel even more domestic.
And that domestic element is exactly why Victorian society freaked out. The home was supposed to be this safe haven,
Yeah.
the center of morality and control. For something this bloody, this almost animalistic to happen inside that supposedly sacred space, it was the ultimate violation. The sheer savagery felt deeply un-Victorian.
Which naturally turns suspicion inwards, right? Police figured out pretty quickly there was no forced entry. So whoever did it had to be someone living there, or someone they knew and let in. The maid, Bridget Sullivan, was looked at initially, but suspicion really quickly focused on the only other person known to be home, Lizzie.
Well, the initial suspicion wasn't really based on hard evidence, more on violated expectations. Lizzie was, on the surface, this respectable 32-year-old woman from a decent family. But the crime itself, the rage, the intimacy, it just didn't fit the picture of what a respectable woman was supposed to be like.
But then, once they started actually talking to her and watching her, her behavior just fueled the fire. It really kicked off the public and police suspicion. Sources point to a few key things. First, her story kept changing. Her testimony was, well, inconsistent.
Yeah, definitely. She gave conflicting accounts about where she was, what she was doing around the times of the murders, and witnesses said that right after the bodies were found, she seemed weirdly calm, detached even. In that era, women were expected to have hysterics, uncontrollable grief after something like that. Her coolness wasn't seen as shock, it was read as cold, calculated guilt.
Let's zero in on her alibi because it was so specific and kind of odd. She claimed that when her father was killed, she was out in the barn for maybe half an hour, looking for fishing sinkers, lead weights for fishing lines.
Fishing sinkers. It's such a strange, overly detailed excuse, isn't it? Doesn't make a lot of sense for a mid-morning chore, especially given what she supposedly walked back into. The police found it totally unbelievable. Imagine the barn, hot, dusty August day. And this story about looking for sinkers just felt flimsy, like a badly written excuse to explain why she wasn't in the house.
So her inconsistent story already had them suspicious. But then came the incident that really sealed it for many people. The burning dress. This became maybe the most damaging piece of circumstantial evidence, suggesting she destroyed proof. Can you unpack that?
Sure. So a few days after the murders, the police are still all over the Borden house searching, and Lizzie is seen by a friend burning a dress, a blue cotton dress, in the kitchen stove. When asked about it, she said the dress was ruined, stained with paint.
But for the police, who are desperately looking for bloody clothes, this is like a giant red flag. Burning potential evidence. Remember, this is way before DNA or modern forensics. A blood-soaked dress would have been the smoking gun. Her explanation about paint just didn't convince anyone, especially given how violent the murders were. There had to be blood spatter.
And this really highlights a core problem for the prosecution later. No murder weapon was definitively found, and potential evidence like the dress was gone. The initial investigation was, let's face it, pretty messy by today's standards. So the prosecution was left with motive, opportunity, and Lizzie's very suspicious behavior, but no solid physical link.
Still, that burning dress incident, that's when public opinion really hardened. The strange woman destroying clothes, she must be guilty. It wasn't long after that Lizzie Borden was formally arrested. The stage was set for the trial in 1893.
And that trial in 1893, it just exploded. It became one of the first huge media-saturated criminal spectacles in America. Think O.J., think Menendez brothers, but happening way back then. The media narrative became almost as important as what was happening in the courtroom.
Newspapers were all over it. Daily updates, sensational headlines. Lizzie, this quiet Sunday school teacher from a respectable family, suddenly became the most famous or infamous woman in America. The whole country was basically debating one thing. Could a woman like her, a woman from a good family, possibly commit such a brutal, savage crime?
That really became the heart of it. The trial wasn't just about finding out who killed the Bordens. It was a massive public argument about Victorian gender roles. It was like a test case. Was this ideal of the passive domestic woman real, or could she actually erupt in violent rage?
The prosecution had a tough job. They laid out the motive, money, basically,
Yeah.
and deep-seated resentment, especially towards her stepmother. They argued Lizzie just snapped under the pressure, the controlling father, the inheritance worries. They tried to show her not as respectable, but as this cold, calculating spinster.
But her defense team, led by George Robinson and Andrew Jennings, they were smart. They knew how to play the social expectations. They didn't just try to poke holes in the circumstantial evidence. Their main strategy was defending the idea of respectable womanhood.
Right. They kept hammering home that Lizzie was religious, a good Christian woman, and therefore she was simply incapable of such savagery. It was an argument that kind of floated above the actual evidence. They basically forced the jury into a choice. Convict Lizzie and admit the Victorian ideal might be a sham, or acquit her and keep that ideal intact.
And crucially, the defense always came back to their strongest point: the lack of physical evidence. Yes, the prosecution had motive, they had opportunity, they had the suspicious behavior. But as the sources stress, there was no physical evidence directly linking her to the crime. They couldn't produce the bloody weapon. They couldn't produce the burned dress.
They did find a hatchet head in the basement, missing its handle, and tried to suggest that was the weapon. But even that was ruled inconclusive. In a case defined by such extreme violence, not being able to forensically connect Lizzie to that violence was a huge failure for the prosecution.
The defense also cleverly used the testimony of the doctor who examined the bodies. He described how difficult it would be to commit those acts without getting absolutely covered in blood. So the defense asked, how could Lizzie have done this, cleaned herself up completely, and disposed of all the evidence so quickly with no trace found?
Okay, let's get to the verdict. Because considering everything, the speed is just remarkable. The jury, all men, of course, took only about 90 minutes. Acquitted.
90 minutes. It's incredibly fast. And the underlying message seems clear looking back through the analyses. The jury chose social order over the circumstantial evidence. The idea that a proper lady simply could not have done something so masculine, so animalistic, that idea was apparently more compelling than all the suspicious actions and inconsistent stories. They acquitted her, essentially preserving the image of Victorian womanhood rather than confronting the terrifying possibility that such violence could come from within a respectable home.
So Lizzie Borden walked out of the courtroom, a free woman. But was she ever really free?
Well, her life after the trial was this strange mix. On one hand, she was rich. She inherited a significant fortune from her father. But on the other hand, she was completely shunned. Fall River society might have been relieved she wasn't convicted. That would have been too disruptive to their worldview, but they still treated her like a pariah. She was ostracized, completely tainted by suspicion.
And she seemed to actively try to reinvent herself, didn't she? Made some very symbolic moves. She bought a big, fancy mansion up on the hill, the wealthy part of town called Maplecroft. And she started going by a different name, Lizbeth Borden, not Lizzie anymore.
Exactly. That name change, Lizbeth, it feels like a deliberate attempt to shed the old identity. To leave behind Lizzie, the repressed daughter in that cramped, unhappy house, and become this new, independent, wealthy woman.
But Maplecroft didn't exactly become a happy haven. She lived there with her sister Emma for about 10 years, but eventually even Emma left. Apparently, the constant suspicion, the social isolation, maybe Lizzie's own behavior, it drove them apart. So Lizzie ended up living alone in this big mansion, became, as one source puts it, a local ghost story in her own lifetime.
Right, and this is where the focus really shifts away from the legal case and towards, well, the legend. The psychocultural analysis kicks in. People start interpreting the meaning of Lizzie Borden, focusing on repression and social entrapment.
Yeah, the idea of gendered rage comes up a lot. Her alleged actions get framed as this huge eruption of female agency through violence, a violent rejection of that suffocating Victorian ideal of docile womanhood. It's like the theory suggests all that repression had to go somewhere, and it finally exploded outwards.
It's a really powerful interpretation. It paints the alleged murders as this primal scream against the limits put on her because of her gender, her class, her unmarried status. One source even draws this interesting comparison. If someone like Ed Gein represents a kind of corrupted masculinity or grotesque perversion, Lizzie Borden comes to embody the breaking point of the angel of the house, femininity turning violently against its constraints, the domestic revolt.
So she becomes this complex figure, maybe a symbol of female empowerment, taking control in the most extreme way possible, but also a figure of absolute horror. And it's that complexity, that ambiguity, that seems to explain why her case basically laid the groundwork for so much modern true crime.
Absolutely. You see all the hallmarks there. The media frenzy, the way facts and speculation get blurred, that persistent gendered fascination with female killers. The Borden case showed that people were hungry for psychological explanations of crime, especially when it happened within the supposedly safe domestic sphere, involving respectable people and shocking violence.
And her image just keeps getting remade in pop culture, right? Films, TV shows, plays. Sometimes she's the cold-blooded killer. Other times she's almost a feminist anti-hero, striking back against the patriarchy. She's like this cultural mirror, reflecting whatever anxieties a particular era has about women, family, money, and violence.
She really is the ultimate enigma. You have the stark physical facts, those two brutal murders, but the question of who did it got swallowed up by the cultural obsession with why and how a woman like Lizzie could have done it. She died in 1927, never confessed, never explained anything, which of course just guarantees the mystery lives on forever. Hashtag outro.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the central puzzle remains, doesn't it? You have the horrifying physical reality of the crime, the weapon, the blood, the sheer rage involved, and yet that reality was ultimately outweighed by these powerful, rigid ideas about Victorian women. And ironically, those very expectations became her defense, the thing that set her free.
Yeah, Lizzie Borden became more than just a murder suspect. She turned into a symbol of what that society feared most about the women it tried so hard to control. The possibility of hidden intelligence, hidden control, and yes, a hidden capacity for extreme violence.
Which brings us to our final thought, something for you to chew on. The Lizzie Borden story has stuck around for well over a century now. It clearly taps into ongoing questions about what really goes on behind closed doors, about female agency, about violence. If her case reflected Victorian anxieties about hidden female power, what anxieties does our own, continued obsession with her story reflect about us today? What modern assumptions or ideals is the ghost of Lizzie Borden still challenging?